It's good to see all of you. I love it that everybody's talking to each other. So many of you know each other. It's fantastic. So we're going to go ahead and get started. It really is good to see so many familiar faces, warm faces, or as Jackie Martin says, shiny faces out there today, for the Riley Institute's second annual Building One South Carolina Forum. Today we recognize the adaptability, the perseverance, community building that brought into being the International African American Museum, the 2023 recipient of the Riley Institute's Building One South Carolina Partners in Progress Award. We celebrate this initiative that has been more than 20 years in the making for its already felt impact. Its impact not only in Charleston and the state of South Carolina, but well beyond. Its resilience on a broad and diverse coalition and its ability to offer lessons for others, many of whom are in this work or in this very room, who seek to catalyze progress in their own communities. But first, let me say thank you. Thank you to all of you who have led the work to create a place that honors Africans who have been brought to this country as enslaved people. So many of them to this very place, the very place that the International African American Museum stands. IAAM is a place that tells their stories, celebrates the amazing contributions made by them and their descendants. And because of your efforts, the IAAM will advance the social and economic progress in Charleston and far beyond. And we are delighted to celebrate you today. If you have been or currently are a part of the collaborative efforts of the International African American Museum, whether on staff or as a donor or as a board member or as an advisor, will you please stand? Let's see who you are. Thank you. This award, the Partners in Progress Award, belongs to the family of One South Carolina Awards. Since 2005, the Riley Institute has celebrated principled leadership among legislators and civic leaders every January at our annual Wilkins Legislative and Civic Leadership Awards, now known as the Riley Wilkins One South Carolina Legislative and South Carolina Civic Leadership Awards. While these awards recognize individuals for their lives of leadership, this award seeks to identify and recognize broad initiatives for their lasting impact in realms such as healthcare, economic opportunity, justice, conservation, arts, and cultures. The physical award, which is displayed on the stage, I think, somewhere. Anyway, the physical award is crafted of crystal and oak. The design is reimagined to suit the nature of the work that we are recognizing. And the oak base on that award is very special to us because it is made from trees that were over 50 years old that were felled on Furman's Grand Boulevard. Last year, we presented the inaugural award to the Spartanburg Northside Initiative, a community-driven transformation of the Northside Spartanburg neighborhood, honoring its past and providing economic, educational, recreational, health, affordable housing, and social opportunities for its residents. We have with us today a few residents and leaders of the Spartanburg Northside Initiative. Will those of you who are here please stand so we can recognize you? Where are you? There you are. Congratulations again on winning that inaugural award. I know that many of you who are with us today, including several of our speakers, had the wonderful opportunity to engage with a diverse group of leaders through the Riley Institute's Diversity Leaders Initiative. Juan Johnson and all members of our DLI team are with us today. I would like you to stand and be recognized if you are a DLI graduate, a Riley Fellow, a current class member, or a member of the Riley Institute DLI team. Please stand. Whoa. Thank you, that makes me very happy. So glad to have all of you with us. And thank you too for the table sponsors who've helped us make this event possible. We really are grateful for your support. In just a couple of minutes, the Riley Institute's Deputy Director, Jackie Martin, is going to come to the podium to provide some additional context about today's forum. But first, I'd like you to join me in watching a brief video produced by South Carolina Educational Television, IAAM, The Power of Place and Story. Please watch.
Our story does not begin in shackles. You know, long before the transatlantic slave trade, our people were philosophers, engineers, physicians, herbalists. So we need to tell those stories because that's part of who we are.
We had a story to tell, and it was an important story for our country, not just local history, and that if it wasn't told here in a place that was so significant in the history of our country and Africans being brought here, if it wasn't told here, then it would be a huge omission and a serious and abject failure of responsibility.
The International African American History Museum belongs in Charleston, belongs in South Carolina. We're located at Gadsden's Wharf, one of our nation's most prolific transatlantic slave trading ports. And when we unearth these spaces, it is a way to come together and unite around a story.
The story of my grandparents, Esau and Janie Jenkins, as told here in the museum, is because they were entrepreneurs, they had businesses, they transported people from the Sea Islands to the city of Charleston to work. And they also helped people with education and healthcare, financial means by opening a credit union, starting a school so that those folks on the Sea Islands had the opportunity to have education like everyone else.
When we talk about all of the African Americans all over the country that will have roots right here, the reason we have a genealogy center, these are all of the things we mean when we say power of place and why we almost become a place of pilgrimage, that everyone would want to come and see and step in this space just a little bit to learn about our history, but also to learn, I hope, quite a bit about themselves as well.
I didn't tell that story for a long time, for most of my life, and now it pours out of me like rushing water. I'm honored and very proud to share the heritage and legacy of both my grandparents, Esau and Janie Jenkins, and to be able to do that here at the International African American Museum is such an honor and privilege for me.
People need to feel the value of their existence, and that's why this couldn't be a slave museum. To me, this had to be demonstrative of a triumph of freedom over slavery, a triumph of democracy over autocracy. It should all add up to making sure that every South Carolinian gets an opportunity to have his or her value celebrated and gets an opportunity to have his or her efforts triumph.
I hope that the work that we've done here to create this museum can be informative to other communities. I don't really believe in lost stories. I believe in temporarily unspoken stories. And I think bringing the community together and reclaiming the story is restorative. It's not whether or not the story itself is difficult. It's the process of reclaiming that helps us resituate ourselves. And this is a community of history. This is a state of history. This is a nation of history. We all have the opportunity to find these places, uncover these stories, and do something transformational for justice, for community, for restoration, for the generation that will come behind us and reclaim the stories we're creating today.
This museum brings with it value. It means that South Carolina is paying homage to the diversity of its citizens, and it means that South Carolina is not running away from its history that South Carolina is being true to our pursuit of a more perfect union.
I am listening.
I am learning.
I am questioning.
I am engaging.
I am discovering myself.
I am on a journey.
And I am Jackie Martin. So good morning, all. I love being in this room with everyone today, with all the present and future graduates of our Diversity Leaders Initiative, with people who care about progress in South Carolina and are actively working to make that happen. It's just great to be here with you guys today. And I wanted to thank our friends at South Carolina ETV for the creation of that video, which provides many here today with the first glimpse of the Riley Institute's second annual OneSouthCarolina Partners in Progress Award. We are so appreciative of our longstanding partnership and friendship with ETV. The Partners in Progress Award was born of our desire to shine a light on landmark collaborative achievements across a broad spectrum of the public realm, as Don pointed to: education, healthcare, economic opportunity, justice, conservation, arts, and culture, not only to laud these singularly important initiatives, but also importantly to offer insights and takeaways that you, leaders from across our state, can take home and perhaps put to work in your own communities. Now, if you are a leader here today from, say, Pelzer or Cope or Peak or Landrum, you could be pardoned for reflecting that while you're happy to be here today to celebrate the amazing achievement that is the International African American Museum, you're not certain that 2 hours spent learning about the why and the how and the what of a $150 million museum is especially relevant to your community. But today, we will come to understand that the IAAM, and yes, the International African American Museum folks do refer to it as the IAM. We will come to understand the IAM as a case study from which everyone in this room can take ideas and inspiration that are relevant to every community in our state, from Greenville to Columbia to Mount Pleasant, yes, but also from Travelers Rest to Plum Branch to Yemassee. We have two linked conversations today. The first conversation's takeaways have to do with daring to dream big, with sticking it out when times get rough, with responding to changes in context and culture, with building partnerships and collaboration. This conversation will be led by South Carolina ETV reporter and producer Thalisha Edie, who is, of course, the local host for NPR's Morning Edition. Thalisha is joined by Dr. Tanya Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum, and Mr. Wilbur Johnson, longtime chairman of the IAM board. Please note that there is a card on your table with a QR code that will take you to speaker bios and another QR code that will allow you to submit questions for the Q&A that will occur after the second conversation today. Please help me in welcoming Thalisha, Dr. Matthews, and Chairman Johnson to the stage.
Wonderful. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, and congratulations on this wonderful honor and being just weeks away from opening.
Thank you.
I bet you feel really good.
Almost.
Almost. Well, Chairman Johnson, I wanted to start with you. This is as you know, as we all know, this is a 23-year project in the making. And for most of those years, you served on the board of directors. And you came on right at a point when the museum was moving out of committee, if you will. I think in 2007, the search was on for the design team, and then first rounds of funding started to come through. So it's becoming very, very real. Talk a little bit about how important it was, or what were your key points, or what were your key items that got you to get support from a broad, diverse group of community members?
Well, the first stage, I suppose, is convincing folks, even convincing ourselves, that this museum could in fact exist, that it was possible, because with a project like this, when there has been nothing preceding it, in a sense, the first obstacle, if you will, is having people understand that it's possible and that there is a reason for its existence, a raison d'etre, to speak, that there's purpose in this effort. And so we spent, when I say we, those of us who were on the board and some of us who are still on the board, spent a great deal of time delivering that message, that there's a reason for this museum, there's a reason for this effort, that there's a purpose involved. And when you're able to articulate that purpose, then people began to understand the reason, understand the objective, and they then are able to make a judgment, a decision, that there's a reason to support the museum, that there's a reason to support it not only financially, but also in many other ways, that is speaking about it and talking it up and telling their friends and neighbors about it. And so we were able to move from the stage of speaking about the museum and delivering the message, the reason for its existence, to speaking with folks about, all right, if you understand the reason, if that is accepted, then this is how we get from point A to point B. These are the concrete dollars, if you will, that we need to begin to make this possible. And this is a reason why you would support it financially. And so delivering that message was, I suppose, the first part of this journey. Making the request for funds, the second part of the journey. And we spent the formative years of the museum doing those things. And I have to say that that a lot of this would not have happened or been able to happen without the presence of Mayor Riley, that is Joseph P. Riley, the former mayor of Charleston, who in his post-mayoralty spent a great deal of time delivering the message that I just spoke with you about. And his credibility, I think, meant a lot for having folks be able to accept this message. But I have to say that it wasn't particularly difficult, that the message was understandable, that people began to grasp the need for this institution. And while it took a while to begin to amass the funds that we needed, we never had any particular difficulty in delivering the message, because we all believed in it, and folks with whom we spoke understood it, and it was not a particularly difficult task to craft a message and to deliver that message. I think the acceptance of that message is what made the fundraising possible.
Dr. Matthews, is there anything you want to add to this?
Well, I think the hindsight of all of this has been helpful in learning the history, and those who have come over the hill. I listened to Chair Johnson. Wasn't that hard? Yes, it was, sir. Yes, it was. But I think that when you really, as you so well stated, when you do believe in the message and you're relentless and you're there, you don't hear the no's. You don't see the disbelief. I think, as you mentioned, I love the way you said in two ways, figuring out what the message is and then convincing people that it's possible. I think when you believe in the message, the idea that it was impossible never occurred to the folks who were on the ground, and we're sort of pushing that forward. And so that's what I've seen in a lot of the places. And so for anyone who's going to get on a similar journey, that always seems easier after you're done. Ish.
So you talk about the influential voice of Mayor Riley, and we saw in the video another influential voice with Congressman Clyburn. In this process, was there great influence from an unexpected source, or a source that may not have been mentioned at the table earlier on?
I don't know, and yes, Congressman Clyburn was essential to the early beginnings of the museum. He was the first board chair, and he helped in many ways to begin to organize the effort. Now, at the same time, he was serving in Congress, so his time to some degree was limited. But he was essential in the early effort. I don't think that there was any, to understand your question was whether or not there was any difficulty in, I don't think there was any particular difficulty in shaping the message that needed to be shaped. It was understandable that we needed to have discussion around the issue of the importation of Africans into this country, and particularly the importation of Africans into the Charleston-area, which, as Dr. Matthews regularly cites, was a major slave port, and I think all of us are aware of that now. So we were able to craft that message, or our message, around that particular fact. And, as Dr. Matthews says hindsight's 20/20, so perhaps I'm overlooking some of the difficulty that we really had. But we were able, I think, to make the message real and understandable. And I have to say that, out of some tragedies can come some good. And when I say that, what I'm referring to is the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, AME. Because as I think back about how this effort began and how it transpired, that event catalyzed, if you will, the thinking about what are we doing and what is it that we need to do going forward to recover from or to address something like what occurred at Mother Emanuel. And at that time, or as a result of that event, people began to ask us, what can we do to help? What can we do to address this? We can't and we shouldn't allow this to go unaddressed. And I think there was a feeling began, or recognition began, that the museum could be a central focus in addressing some of the ills that were revealed with the Mother Emanuel tragedy.
Dr. Matthews, as president and CEO, as an author and as a poet, we just heard, we talked a little bit about kind of the external voices that helped influence support for this project. But talk a little bit about the institution being a first voice institution and the importance of voice.
So when we talk about museums, there are all kinds of museums, wonderful places. For history museums or storytelling museums, when we mean a first voice museum, we mean an African American perspective on African American history. Right? So we have our larger and our broader institutions and museums, but there's something particularly special about having it in that way. So you'll see it in a lot of subject-specific museums or culturally specific museums. And I would say it's one of the reasons why locating this museum in South Carolina, in the Low Country, in Charleston, were one of, I think, the strongest communities of cultural heritage and African-American voice and perspective, that being the Gullah Geechee community. And many generations of folks who participated in and returned back from the Great Migration. It creates an amazing hub of these voices and these stories. So it's also one of the things that powerfully locates us here in this space.
Would you like to add anything to that, Chairman? The importance of voice? Yeah.
I think she's covered that. Yeah.
When dealing with this topic, it can be very painful. What was it like to start to gather these voices and to gather these stories? How did the community interact with you all as you tried to pull together or cull this information?
One of the things that we think about, in terms of our mission of honoring these untold stories is about unearthing them. And the first thing I think you actually have to do is recognize that the stories are being held and that they're known. And you need to create not a safe space, a trusted space for telling those
What's the
stories.
difference?
So I think that safe spaces are an illusion. I think that if you are talking about something that is difficult and it's going to have challenge, it's not about being safe. It's about being courageous. And courage is not required in safe spaces. A trusted space is a space where you can trust that you will be heard and listened to, and that those stories will be taken not only in their full context, but as the gift that they are intended, right? That they will be properly used. And I think that, we have a history of working through stories, of using these stories properly. And so as we're planning for the opening, one of the things that excites me and scares me most is the number of advisory boards we've had in 23 years. There are a lot of people who contributed a lot of stories, some informal roundtables, some would just write a letter, stick it in the mail, and expect for it to be opened and heard, and sort of bringing those and documenting those. So I think that was the first step. But then after that, the rumor mill kicks in, which is very helpful. If you have a good experience, you tell your story, you feel heard, you feel listened to, you're going to tell other people, so that when you get the call to share that story, the same thing. I think that our Center for Family History in particular, our Genealogy Center, has really inspired this because one, of course, we're collecting stories for the museum, but we're providing the means for folks to unearth their own stories. And if there's anything folks love to talk about, it is themselves. And so the Genealogy Center actually helps us to do that. And so I think that has been a very, very powerful way. And yes, some of these stories are painful, but hiding and submerging that pain is even more painful than the telling of the story that holds that.
When thinking about dreaming big and building community, what was the process like working with other organizations and institutions in the Charleston area and throughout South Carolina with similar missions?
It has been extraordinarily reinforcing. So one, we are a community, the arts and culture space, museum space, nonprofit space. We're all part of very similar work. So there's always that wink and a nod. Do not underestimate the wink and the nod in terms of understanding that there's difficult work. But there's also being pointed in the direction of tried and true practices, things that we know that have worked, things that we know that have not worked. Your earlier question about the stories, our sister institutions also point us to the stories.
Okay.
Have you talked to so-and-so? We have this in our archives. So I think that has been very helpful as well. And the one thing to recognize is that even as the International African American Museum comes on board, as we are unique, special, one of a kind, we are stepping into an ecosystem of those of us who are doing this work in important ways. And it's been very helpful for me to be onboarded and educated about the ecosystem and for our team as well. And we've been really welcomed and folks have been really, really excited to have us as a partner. And all figure out how we can tell our own parts of the story and continue to move ourselves forward.
Every nook and cranny of South Carolina has stories that need to be told. And as people look at the work and the progress in your journey, and they may start to think, okay, how can I bring this to my county or to my hometown? What are some key points for them to kind of look out for? Because when you get the idea that it's wonderful and it's great and you're energized behind it, but as you start the process, there may be some barriers or some bumps in the road, but through the lens of your experience, what should other people kind of be prepared for so that they don't get kind of blocked a little bit and that their vision can come to fruition?
That is a really good question. I would say the first thing is that as large as the museum is, will be the second largest African American history museum in the country when we open. We are not here to tell all the stories. We are simply here to celebrate the proof that all stories can be told. And so that's very different, right? So that's one. We're here to be a partner and to be inspiration. Two, the story is there somewhere. Somebody got the story. Now, several people may be holding on to different pieces of the story, but may not even be aware that other pieces exist. So this coming together, this wrangling, this conversation, the challenges around authority and ownership and stewardship, all of these are very different words when you're in this space. And I think that when you walk into a journey like the museum, many have asked, wow, how did it take 23 years? If you understand the work, it's, wow, how did you get it done in just 23 years? And so I would say the second lesson around that is an impatient patience, right? You're going to need patience because this is going to have time, but you want to be impatient about it, right? You want to acknowledge that it takes time, but you want to be relentless in the idea that it cannot be forever. But you do want to make room for that. The third part is, and I continue to be amazed, I continue to be amazed by support from what I would call the unusual suspects.
Okay.
You'd be, I think, amazed that there are a lot of folks who love a good story, love history, love the truth, simply love where they're from. And whatever happened, where they're from, they're on board. They just want to know where they're from and what happened. And so the art of facilitation is not an inclination, it's a skill set. And it's something that we really have to work on. And so if you're in that space and you're trying to bring communities together, the last thing I would say is to take this idea of facilitation very, very seriously. And be prepared for almost everything and anything to happen in the room.
Chairman Johnson, you brought up Mother Emanuel, and I want to talk a little about having to pivot when undertaking a massive project like this. A lot can change in 23 years. When you guys started, our cities and towns didn't look like what they look like now. Population sizes are different, and then just cultural shifts. Take us through that journey, that 23-year journey, about how you had to pivot or adjust as you work towards this goal.
Well, to sort of piggyback on something Dr. Matthews said and your question about story, I think it's useful to to understand and to recognize that there was and still is to some degree a reluctance to approach the story, that there still is some reluctance to speak about slavery and slavery as it affected Charleston and other areas throughout the state and indeed this country. Some would say, and I suspect that some still say, that is something that in the past and that we should not be wanting to continue to speak about. But the idea, I think the central reason to some degree for this museum is for us to be able to have these conversations and for us to be able to recognize what took place and for us to be able to wrestle with it and to engage with it and to understand from the stories that Dr. Matthews has just mentioned how we can move this state forward, how we can move this community forward, how we can move this country forward with having recognized and having wrestled with those stories. Now, Mother Emanuel added another layer to that because it was an event that was so complex in many ways. But fundamentally, the Mother Emanuel event generated the question of how could this happen in this time, in this space, and in this community? And not only that, but what can we do about it? And our argument or our response was that the museum can be a central part of that effort. And not only did we respond in that manner, but we were asked whether the museum would be willing to play a role in the recovery from Mother Emanuel. And so that transition, I think, was very helpful as we began to shape how the museum would exist and what we would be doing going forward.
Dr. Matthews.
I think that moments like that give us the inability to avoid, I think, the conversation, right? So that was one of the moments that captivated the nation, captivated this community. It violated sanctuary, right? And particularly in the South, we believe in sanctuary, right? We believe in church. That's the one place. That is the one place. And so it forced us all to pause. And it answered the question of, do we really have to talk about this? And it became clear, yes, we do. And so it moved to the real question, which is how? Like, sort of how do we talk about this? And could have talked about it in many, many ways. And the city, the community had this great gift that the museum project was already moving in and already in those spaces. Those moments in and of themselves are transformative. It just is. And I think for the museum to be able to take advantage of that, to acknowledge that moment was really important. And so a lot of folks who were resistant to come to the table in any way came not to say, okay, let's go forward. They came to say, all right, tell me more. Like, how could we do this? How could we get into this space? And it did help to underscore that it does still matter. And if you ask me, I'm a little bit biased, I think museums are the best way to do this. We are one of the places where it is okay to learn together, where it is expected to be ignorant in public. That's the whole reason you go to a museum, to learn something that you don't know. If you go to a museum and you know everything in the museum, you're literally gonna say, it's pretty, but I didn't learn anything. And so to have that opportunity inside that was, I think, transformative and pivotal, just as our very recent years in history have been.
And our closing remarks. June 27th is right around the corner. What are your hopes and your dreams and aspirations for the work that you guys have toiled in for so long?
You want to tackle that? That's a that question inspires a lot of sentiments, because having been involved with this project for almost all of those 23 years, it is amazing to believe that we're at the point that we are at this moment. Our hope originally for the museum was that we could build, or we could create, an institution that would begin to, or that would be instrumental in telling the stories of the importation of Africans into this country, and particularly into Charleston. But I think as we have moved forward over the 23 years or so, we also understand that we can, and not only that we can, but that we should do more than simply focus on the importation of African slavery itself, but also tell the stories of what happened to Africans and African Americans post-slavery. What have we done, or what have the ancestors and descendants of those Africans done in Charleston? How have we contributed to the wealth that has been generated in areas like Charleston and throughout the country? What structures have we been instrumental in building? How have we affected the economy of places like Charleston and beyond? Those are the things that we, I think, intend and will intend to focus on in the museum.
I think for me, this hasn't been a sprint, it's been a relay, right? And that baton has been handed and handed and handed and handed. And so I think that my biggest hope for myself, and actually for the team that's there now, we're the anchors. We didn't start this race. We're the ones who are here to carry it over this first of many finish lines. And so I think one of my my biggest hopes and dreams is that people are proud. That those who have been on the 23-year journey, or the 10-year journey, or the 15-year journey are proud, and that they come in and they say, yes, this is what I gave up 12 years of my life for. This is looking good. And that it is perhaps beyond some of the things that they imagined. And so I feel that pressure, and I'm excited about that. I think the second thing that I would like is I would like for it to reignite visitors' imagination about what is possible. What is possible for these conversations, what is possible for impact, what is possible for understanding, and to feel all of the emotions. If we tell the full journey, you'll feel all of the emotions. And then the last is to absolve a fear. You don't want to throw a party and no one shows up. So the person has been worried about that, but opening day is sold out. So at least I got that part going in terms of that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Matthews, Chairman Johnson, thank you, and again, congratulations. That's
Thank you, Felicia, Dr. Matthews, and Chairman Johnson. I think all of our communities, much can be gained when we dream big and build relationships and persevere and adapt to change. So our next discussion will look at the museum itself. It will speak to the power of place, at the unique opportunity afforded by placing this museum at Gadsden's Wharf. And it wasn't always going to be a Gadsden's Wharf, which is something that you'll hear a little bit more about going forward, and at the experiences and the resources that the museum offers to the state and nation. To launch this second discussion, we'll now hear via live video from, is Walter with us? We'll now hear via live video from landscape architect, public artist, and educator Walter Hood, who designed the landscape that lives under and around the building of the IAAM. Mr. Hood is professor and former chair of landscape architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, and is principal of Hood Design Studio in Oakland. His practice is not about where do we put the crepe myrtles. He has a process wherein he investigates place. He then layers archival and oral histories with the physical, environmental, and social patterns that he uncovers in this work, and melds these together to discover these and uncover these untold stories. Familiar stories, but reshaped through this process that he brings to his work. Mr. Hood is the Goldman Sachs Design Fellow for the Smithsonian Institute and is a 2019 recipient of the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Award. Please welcome Walter Hood.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining you this morning. I'm in Oakland, California, so if my eyes look a little closed, it's very early in the morning. But I'd like to, first of all, congratulate the International African American Museum on this prestigious award, Dr. Matthews, Mr. Johnson. And listening to you this morning, I'm just reminded of how long this journey has been for myself as well. Not as long as Mr. Johnson, but I think my studio has been involved in this work between 10 and 12 years. The Low Country is a very powerful landscape. I was born in North Carolina. I knew very little about South Carolina, being from that northern state. But over the last 20 years, I got a chance to really understand that our stories were interconnected and that they were very powerful. Dr. Matthews talked about this idea of telling stories. And, our work in my studio, we've been trying to talk about the American landscape through a myriad of voices. We've probably designed about a half dozen museums across the country, but this is the first one that we basically had a chance to come into a community and try to deal with this kind of thick layer of history. And as said with our museum in Washington, D.C., it's hidden in plain sight, our history, but we have to have the courage to see it. Most of the time we're walking around with our eyes closed because it's just a safer way to navigate our days. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everything works. Okay. The museum project for us has been a long journey. And looking at it from the harbor, you actually begin to see what the esteemed architect Harry Cobb had in mind when he pushed that this site was really important. This is sacred ground. He designed a building that hovers above the landscape. And when he first talked to me about taking this job, he said, Walter, the project is very, very important that the ground resonates with this power of what's beneath it. And as soon as we started the project, I asked Mayor Riley then, had there been an archaeological report? There hadn't. And within a month, we found actually the real harbor 7 feet down below, and we found remains, which reinforced that this was indeed a site. But how could we actually get the community together to actually tell this story and how to design this site? And one of the first things I thought was, let's put together a committee of historians, teachers, architects, local, interested people, and let's go out into the Low Country. We went out to Sullivan's Island. This is the first place where the enslaved would have hit American soil. They were placed in what was called pest houses at Fort Moultrie. And one of the epiphanies that I had when we were there, this is us standing around a chair. And this was not a historic element, but this is a chair put out by the esteemed Toni Morrison Pulitzer winner. And this is her bench by the road that she has placed throughout the diaspora of African inhabitation. And I was taken by all of us in this historic site. This was one of the few places that people took pictures of. And this is a contemporary element. And what that began to say that within the museum that's in the back of the exhibition hall, that this meager holdings was not powerful enough to tell the story. and that there had to be these other more contemporary elements that did the job. We then studied the site archaeology, and we found that we could actually mark and place where that original line was, which actually emerges with our design. You can see the map here on the left. We then went to Middleton Place. We spent a day at a plantation. And this was probably one of the more awkward places because as we were going around, we were actually led by the tour guide. And again, this kind of interest that everyone had, what was not being said? You know, why were we not talking about the design of the landscape, the labor that made this landscape? And looking at the features, the design of the detail. As you walk through Charleston, you can actually see the hands of young kids in bricks. And then going and driving through a lot of the small settlements that a lot of people probably are not privy to, that at emancipation, a lot of the plantations in the Low Country actually deeded their land to their free slaves, from 6 miles to Scannionville to Phillips, where I worked a lot, along 41 and 8 Mile, Hamlin, Snowden, and really talking about these places still exist. And these communities have been there over hundreds of years. And then really trying to understand the semiotic, right? As a landscape architect, I learned very early the colonial gardens came from France, but we never taught that they were also these places where labor was used to sort of bring about this amazing economy in the South, and how through the vision of making as well as articulating certain things, we could begin to have a discussion. And very early then we talked about this idea of water. We talked about ideas of planting. We talked about microclimate. We talked about the geology of the ground. We then begin to sort of look at other places and how could we begin to imagine the site through light, through passage, through materials, water, reflection. All of these were part of a larger conversation that we had over a 60-day period. And at the end of that 60-day period, we presented about 30 different ideas. And these ideas, some of them we put out just to get people to sort of be more audacious. And some things were rejected because maybe they were too powerful. But in the end, a hybrid plan manifests itself from a lot of these images. And so when you come to the museum, what you will find under this football field long elevated building, you will find a ground plane composed of tabby shells. You will find a landscape to the north that's reflective of the Low Country landscape. And to the south, you'll find the archaeological site of the place where our ancestors, some didn't make it and perished, others were sold into bondage. When you arrive at the museum from the city side, we wanted to agitate the ground to talk about that there is something here. And again, we wanted to talk about the hydrology of the island itself and this notion that there was a primary dune that one had to make their way through. And then looking back again to the south, we wanted to mark where the warehouse was, knowing that we don't own the entire site, but we wanted to create that edge with a wall and a gauntlet that one moves through. And then looking back towards the city, those dunes that I talk about mask a foreground, but actually begin to sort of create this armature that encapsulates. And here in this image, you can see the tabby on the ground, the shells that actually come up to form the columns. And Mr. Cobb wanted those columns to be at least 2 meters wide so that they felt like the ground was actually holding the building up. And then when you get to the warehouse, we wanted people to become face to face, right, with the rice Negroes, these figures that again sold into bondage, but through this reflection, this becomes a place of contemplation, but also a place of meaning and getting people to kind of think about themselves as well as the past. And as you make your way through the North Gardens, we've tried to sort of create a set of small gardens that articulate many things, again, from the geology, the tribal, the different diversity of the different tribes that came in, the ethnobotanical sort of use of plant materials. And then more important for us, we wanted to sort of make a place where there could be comfort, but also uncomfort. And as you go out to the front of the museum looking towards the harbor, I was taken by this cartoon that's from Fulton Moultrie, that exhibition I talked about, and how abstracted it had taken the Brooks map, which is a very important lithograph from the Dutch ship that showed, how the enslaved were crammed into the hull of the ships, which really created, right, a visual understanding of these atrocities. And taking this, we wanted to sort of create a ground plane that could also become a metaphor for the Atlantic crossing. So we've created a fountain above the hull. It sits above the bulkhead, and it stretches along the entire extent of the museum. And here we wanted there to be a kind of a tide reference, but also one of memory. And these figures are etched in the concrete, and the tabby actually comes up to form the body. When the water fills up and drops out, it leaves puddles. And these puddles begin to manifest these different figures in the ground plane that, again, becomes a blessing and also a reflection and an understanding that we're in this place at this time. And like Toni Morrison's Bench by the Road, this is a place where we can come to hear our ancestors, to think about them, looking back out towards the Atlantic. And as you make your way back across, this is that line that I talked about, that original line that one crosses over and one has an understanding of that boundary. The museum now is coming to fruition. There's spaces in which people can come and actually move away, as I talked about, for comfort, but there's also these places of agitation, right? These places that begin to force us to reconcile the ground, but also the community and the place. And I'm hoping next month when this opens, all of these ideas, actually when people feel it, these singular ideas go away and they become more complex through these conversations that one has and through the kind of comfort, but also the pain and joy that we can actually share with one another on this hallowed ground. And again, I congratulate the museum and thank you all for coming out this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter Hood, for your comments today and for being part of this important work. So the power of place, that's where we've arrived in this discussion at this time. We're now going to talk about how it serves community well-being, how it stands to advance social progress, to reproduce Brooks' soulless diagram as a tidal pool on the far edge of Gadsden's Wharf, to build a museum telling the story of the international African American experience at the very wharf where tens of thousands of stolen Africans were landed and sold into slavery. We are here to honor the International African American Museum and to distill its lessons for further use. Every town in South Carolina has stories. Everyone in this room has a role to play, and many of you are engaged in doing so. What does it avail us as a community to share a reimagined map of Columbia with renamed downtown streets commemorating women who have advanced social justice on numerous fronts, for Jewish people and African Americans, for women who sought to vote, for women who sought to compete? What do we gain as a people when we collect soil and erect markers and foster dialogue at the sites of documented lynchings in our state? When we identify and document the history, cultural practices, heritage sites, and natural resources associated with the Gullah Geechee people of 4 southern states and designate them in the aggregate as a national heritage area, as the cohesive, nationally important landscape that they indeed comprise. To document the often unseen and untold stories of the LGBTQ+ community in South Carolina through oral history collections, story mapping, and document collection and display. Maps, markers, memorials, monuments, museums. How do these acts of documentation and storytelling serve everyone in this room? How do they foster empathy and respect and healing? To continue this conversation about the power of place and about the experiences and resources this museum offers to Charleston, the state, the nation, and beyond, I invite legendary journalist Beryl Dakers, Director of Special Projects and for Content for South Carolina ETV, Charleston Mayor John Tecklenburg, Ms. Malika Pryor-Martin, IAAM's Chief Learning and Engagement Officer, and again, Dr. Tanya Matthews to the stage.
Yeah. Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Where do you want me?
You're right here, John.
Not that far.
I think you're right here.
You're right here.
Okay.
Now, see, that's what happens when they cut your mic on too soon. You can't say what you want to say to the people that you're about to talk to. So I'm going to say it to you all as well. Good morning, by the way.
Good morning.
What a beautiful crowd we have with us today. This is exciting. I'm reeling over that word legendary, which sounds like old. That's what it means. But I am delighted to be here to help facilitate this conversation. And that's what it's going to be, a conversation more so than a panel. So if I address a question to you and you feel like you want to chime in, somebody else, feel free to do that. I am going to begin with Malika Pryor-Martin, who is the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer for the museum, because it's under her direction that the programs of the museum are enhanced and taken on both internally and externally. So Malika, building on what Walter Hood just said,
Yes.
I want to explore that whole notion of a sense of place and the fact that we actually relocated to Gadsden's Wharf, that was not the original site for the museum. How important is that? That's part one.
Okay.
And part two is, would you share with us some of the significant things that have happened already pre the opening of the museum to enhance that?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that question, Beryl. The power of place. So I'm going to personalize my answer just a little bit. I've been in the business of museums for a little over 13 years now and in nonprofit programming for over 20. And one of the things that attracted me to the International African American Museum in particular was how much Charleston represented three things that relate to both time, space, and humanity. And that is that Charleston is as uniquely itself as it is regionally and nationally impactful, as it is a diasporic and international city. And when thinking about the port broadly, but then Gadsden's Wharf more specifically, what does it mean for people who are coming from, quite frankly, across the continent, but particularly concentrated in West and West Central Africa, across this edge, that it becomes their introduction to a completely new world, and presumably in most instances a life that their children inherited, which is being owned by other human beings in perpetuity. And you're coming into conversation with those individuals who have also come from someplace else. And perhaps you engage in the brave act of self-emancipation. And maybe that leads you north, but in some instances it leads you south. And you find yourself engaged in conversation with another group of people who might have made their way here, but by no stretch of the imagination we know got here first. So there's all of these intersections, these ways in which people are coming into conversation with each other, and there's this way in which Charleston is playing a very central role in that. That was incredibly interesting to me as a museum person, but I think more importantly from the perspective of human experiences, American experiences, the African diaspora, Charleston becomes a quintessential story to tell. That's compelling. because how better to tell a story than to do it in the very space and place where the story unfolds, where for hundreds of thousands of people, particularly of African descent, their American story begins. And where, as a result of them being brought here, not as immigrants, not as an Ellis Island story, but as involuntarily, as labor and intelligence, give birth to a new body of people in another part of the world. I don't think you can necessarily do it better. I think it can be done brilliantly. I've worked at other museums. Shout out to all those other museums. I think it can be done brilliantly at other places, but I think that there's a particular way and a particular weight and a particular power that comes with doing it where it occurred.
Nobody else wants to jump in on that sense of place?
I think for me, the only thing that I would add is also the concept of pilgrimage. Right? It's places that you want to go. And we think about things that are important to us. This is the actual desk that something was signed. This is the actual place where your mom and dad decided to get married. It can be those personal things or those big picture things, but there is also something about the power of place and pilgrimage. And as we talk about sort of coming to the museum and being in the museum, we've had guests and visitors, and they stand there and they literally say, "So you mean right here, like right here, like this is the edge." And they're caught and they're fascinated and they're grounded in that space. And so I think that it melds perfectly with the story of South Carolina and also the brand and heritage of Charleston, right? Mm-hmm. This is where people come. We bring people here to learn, and folks come here for the buildings, or the shrimp and grits, but they come for these reasons, and so we are a site of journey and an endpoint for so many folks. And so I think having this museum with this power of place becoming yet another site of pilgrimage for Charleston, for the Low Country, for South Carolina, is, as Malika said, can't be done better.
Mayor John, you know, plans for IAAM were well underway when you began mayor in 2016. Even though the physical construction had not been begun, this was indeed a legacy project for your predecessor, Mayor Joe Riley, and much of the groundwork had already been explored, positively and negatively in some senses. What were the specific challenges for you then in lending your support, and why was it important for you to do so?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a challenge. Good morning, everyone, first of all. And what an honor it is to serve as mayor as we open the International African American Museum. And after I sold a business I had for years in the 90s, I went to work for the city of Charleston for Mayor Riley as the director of economic development. And it was then, 25 years ago, that Mayor Riley had this vision. I'll never forget the first employee we hired. We assigned someone in the planning department. Her name was Carol E. Williams, and I would go, she was right across the hall from me, and I would go visit her from time to time to see how it was going. It was a lonely office she had at that time, very lonely. So I must digress and say, Mayor Rickman, I was living here in Columbia when then Governor Riley became governor, and Governor, you inspired me to a life of public service. And then I went to work for Mayor Riley, and he served for 40 years. So you might, and I'm a Riley Fellow now, so you might say I've been living the life of Riley all this time. It hasn't been a challenge. It's just absolutely the right thing to do. I'm proud that we were able to break ground and build this beautiful building. By the way, this is one of the most beautiful and best buildings that the city of Charleston has ever built in its 353-year history. The site is powerful, it's sacred. The building you saw, the design of Walter Hood showed, it's just amazing thoughtfulness all the way through, and we're all, as South Carolinians, going to be so proud. So it was easy.
You must have been talking with Wilbur Johnson over there, because it was easy things. And yet, you did have some rough waters in terms of being able to cull the total community support for this. Talk a little about that. Talk about, and you all who talk about community engagement, let's explore that a little for others as they look at how they might take these points back to their home communities. What do you do when there are disparate or unbelieving or questioning voices who may not immediately buy in to what you want to do?
Well, we've experienced that as well. After I was reflecting when Wilbur was discussing the impact of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, and I brought forward to City Council a resolution for the city to apologize for its role in slavery. And a lot of people stood up and said, why do you need to do that? You don't need to remind us about those days. And I dug into the story about the city's involvement, direct involvement in the institution of slavery. And I must say that this is kind of not karmic revenge, but karmic justice. I view this museum as providing an incredible opportunity, not just for Charleston, the Low Country, the Gulf Geechee Corridor, but South Carolina, for African American businesses to be created and to thrive. And the reason I mention that is for centuries, the city of Charleston profited and was in the midst of the administration of slavery in this state. So listen to this real quickly. I'll try. 3 ways. When the slave arrived at Gadsden's Wharf for sale, the city of Charleston earned a commission on that sale. If then the owner who bought the enslaved, before we had property taxes on your home, there was a property tax, a head tax on your slave. Then we devised the first business license system, probably in America. It was a license system for the city to collect a fee on the rental of enslaved labor. So on the sale, the rental, and the ownership of the enslaved, the city of Charleston profited and contributed to its budget. But here was the part of the story I'd never heard growing up, and it blew me away. The city of Charleston operated a torture house. We call it the workhouse. If you owned a slave, and for whatever reason you did not want to punish him yourself, you could just turn him over to the city. And by city ordinance, we had a fee structure for how much we would charge you to put on the chains, to perform the whippings. Now, we're very compassionate. No more than 225 whippings per week. I mean, it just blew my mind. And to have folks come forward and say, why do we, need to do this? Why do we need to even talk about this? You damn right we needed to talk about it. You damn right we needed to apologize for it. And this museum offers those conversations to go forward, but also for economic opportunities as well.
Well, we're going to explore the economic opportunities in just a moment, and I'm glad you provided that historical perspective, because it brings us up to, so how did you deal with what was going on contemporarily?
So I think one of the great powers and the great advantage of community conversation is that it is never one and done, and that you are always called to go back, re-engage, and revisit. The great challenge of community conversations is that you are never one and done, and you are always called to go back and to revisit conversations. So when you talk about a project that takes 23 years, you are constantly revisiting, right? And so there is the aftermath of, say, Hugo, and how the community would want to have conversations in that space. And then there is the 2008-2009 economic crash that is affecting people differently, and that's a conversation. Then there's Mother Emanuel, then there's 2020, then there's 2021 and 2022. That season just did not stop. But thinking about the way that people are engaging with these stories and the impacts and the legacies are a constant evolution. And when you're in this space of contextualizing these stories, you have to keep going back. And so for anyone else who's on this journey, I would say that that is one of the lessons that the museum has learned and continues to learn, and that we share and that we pass on. And so I'm actually excited and motivated by that, because I'm on several learning curves, and so these conversations are helping me to kind of take all of this information in. But I think that that is what the challenge is. And I think that what concerns people in these spaces is not about the pain in the story that's being told. It's, will I be heard? Will I be listened to? Mm-hmm. And then the second part is, what happens if someone sitting next to me feels a different emotion to the same story? Like how do I do that? Well, if I'm sad and they're angry and she's nonchalant, like where do we sort of go from there? And so I think that we get better at those conversations. It harkens back to what I thought about facilitation. But when you talk about community engagement, it's more than the single committee, the single advisory board, the launch conversation. It does have to come back, and it does have to revisit, and to never underestimate the perspectives that folks have, and the way that current moments call us to rethink what we had thought about a story or a history, and how far back that folks want to take those conversations.
And this sort of harkens back to something Dr. Matthews mentioned in the first panel about being trusted. I would say that when you're in the work of uncovering, excavating, engaging stories, from an institutional perspective, it's really, really, really important to value the words that you speak, such that you value the import of keeping your word, that your word is precious. Because for many communities, their stories feel as though they are the only thing that they own. So when endeavoring to ask that they vest them with you, regardless of how grand or how boutique and bespoke the scale, it's so important that from an institutional perspective, we are keeping our word, so that when we're engaging these communities, they can build trust, because so often that's one of the things that's consistently been broken. Sometimes when especially when you're the big fellow on campus, it can be easy to forget that something that feels or has a relatively minor impact on us, in fact, can be heartbreaking or re-traumatizing for communities, because their histories and their stories are so incredibly precious. So as co-creators, it's just incredibly important, I would say, to make sure that we remember and keep our word. And then if we ever find ourselves breaking it, that we're really, 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 really fast in owning and being accountable. Because again, when you hold power, and sometimes when you're a smaller nonprofit, you feel like you're the little guy on campus, but relative to the small community that's having the conversation with you, you are the big fellow in the room. So remembering that power and authority is relative, and just being very, very mindful about holding our word, keeping our word, and whenever we fail, being incredibly accountable. Because those who are in authority often don't have to own accountability. But when you're talking about someone's story, which is their life, it's their legacy, it's a part of who they are, it's incredibly important that we're doing that.
Would you follow that a little bit further and talk about actual outreach and involvement? And some of the things you've done already, for example. We're not talking about just sitting back in the Golden Palace and issuing forth proclamations about what you're going to do. You got to get out there in the trenches.
Oh, you'll be summoned, and you better go. I say so. I'm not originally from South Carolina. I'm not originally from. Well, then obviously I wouldn't be originally from Charleston or the Low Country. So I'm very, very open as soon as I arrive around foregrounding the fact that I am a Kumya.
Definitely Kumya.
I'm not a Benya.
She only come here a year ago.
True, true. And so, regardless of my title or my experience in museum space, I have to really be very mindful about how new I am to this space, how specific, how particular, how unique this space is. So when sitting in conversation, let's say, with settlement communities east of the Cooper, I'm not doing most of the talking. I'm striving to do most of the listening, ensuring that the concerns of the community are concerns that I'm really hearing, that I'm taking them in, that I'm also being honest and foregrounding what is a museum. I have, as a representative of the institution, the capacity to do or to not do. So I think understanding the scope of one's own work is so incredibly important in this, because sometimes you'll show up and people, you do build that trust, and they're like, well, can you do, are you also able to? Well, what about that thing over there? Well, you know we've got issues over yonder. And all of them are important, but as an institution that does a specific body of work, knowing what you can and what you aren't in a position to do is also incredibly important to being able to sustain and maintain that trust. But absolutely, I think one, it's coming from a place of humility, even if you are the one with the funding and the dollars and the people. It is listening. And then again, it is keeping your word. If you say you're going to take an action and you're going to make sure that folks have an opportunity to be in conversation with the work before it's put on display, you better make sure that folks are able to be in conversation with that work and see it before it's put on display. Because that is what will also, I think, particularly when you're a public institution, it endears the community to you. You don't always have the new car smell. You aren't always the newest, cutest thing on the block. There's a point in time where you're going to be reliant on your local and regional community to care about the fact that you exist. And the way that you start the institution has a lot to do with whether or not you're able to sustain moving forward.
I see Mayor Tecklenburg is on the edge of his seat here. He wants to talk about this cultural tourism piece. So I'm going to get to you, but right after the CEO tells us about the trends in cultural tourism and how IAM can actually actualize it in a way that our communities here might also take a hint.
So one of the things, so cultural tourism, when you're specifically going somewhere to do more than sit on a beach, right? You're going to visit a place, a museum, it's a historical community, something happened there. Over the last decade or so, particularly when it comes to cultural tourism that relates to what we like to refer to as, say, difficult conversations or hidden cultural truths, there has been far more interest in getting a broader perspective in the story. When Walter mentioned earlier that part of the tension of some of the tours was listening to all the things that were not being said. Right? That used to be an academic thing. It used to be a thing that museums thought about and sculptors thought about. Now it's what tourists are actually thinking about. And so we're in a space where cities, communities, sites that prize and prioritize tourism, cultural heritage tourism as this economic driver, are being confronted with that, right? It's sort of beyond the nostalgia. It is not an elimination of the nostalgia. It is, we want the broad story. We want everything. We want the architecture and the story behind who built the architecture. You know, we want the horse and carriage, and we want to know who took care of that horse and who created that carriage. So it's that whole kind of thing. So when you have places like the International African American Museum and our sister institutions, the Smithsonian, the EJI down in Alabama, these institutions are gathering a lot of attention. And I may say pilgrimage, Explore Charleston may say
tourist, sort of in that it's that same way. And so the museum is coming online, and these conversations are happening at the time when that is the expectation of the visitor, of the customer, of the tourist, of the pilgrim, whatever words you want to use. And so there is something that can be built on that, and I think it reminds communities that there is a socio-economic impact when we do this. Yep, some folks are in it to do the right thing. Some folks are in it to make the good dollar. Some folks are in to move the community forward, but it's all weaving together, and I think it's why Charleston, the surrounding communities and counties and the state have gotten behind the museum in a way that I have been fascinated by as I've learned about kind of the 360-degree support. That awareness that if done right, we can support a lot of these boxes that we're trying to fill.
All right. Mayor, it's your turn now. And let's talk specifically about how that might benefit Black businesses. Because when you talk about cultural tourism, the first things the folks say is, hey, that doesn't affect us. You know, we're swamped with cultural tourism now, and we're not getting a bit of this.
That's right. So we all know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had so many beautiful and thoughtful quotes. And one that I remember so well, you know, he said that the hardest part of the civil rights struggle would end up being economic empowerment. And I'll paraphrase it, but something to the effect of, what good will it do to desegregate the lunch counter if you ain't got enough money to buy a hamburger? And y'all, this museum and this era, if you will, of cultural and heritage tourism creates a great opportunity to create and support Black, African-American, minority businesses, and the whole Charleston region. The city, our Explore Charleston Visitors Bureau are behind this effort. Not just to visit other cultural sites. That's a natural for the museum to be a springboard to direct people to the reconstruction sites down in Beaufort and other Gullah Geechee corridor sites all up and down the corridor, which thankfully Congressman Clyburn founded, but to support businesses. And I got to share with you, this is a little sad, less than 10% of the tourism-related businesses in the Charleston region are owned by African Americans. And that can change. We had an Opportunity Expo at the city just about a month ago for women and minority-owned businesses and prospects. 700 people showed up. 700 prospective existing and new businesses that can be formed in Charleston to help support this. Did you know cultural and heritage tourism is the largest growing component of tourism in the country today? And even in South Carolina, College of Charleston tells us that there was a $2.4 billion economic impact from African American tourists coming to South Carolina. We have a great opportunity, so we have to provide some resources. The city has ramped up its lending for minority and women-owned business. After the first year, I am real proud to share with y'all that we're opening our first entrepreneurial resource center just for minority and women-owned businesses. We're also going to do the same with a retail space on King Street, one of the top 10 retail streets in America, dedicated to minority and women-owned businesses. The springboard that the museum can serve for not just other cultural sites, but for businesses is a remarkable opportunity, and we're going to work to take advantage of that.
That's also, it's really important to some of Malika's points around credibility, right? Part of credibility is listening. The other part is folks expect you to know stuff, right? And so as we bring in this space, as people go through the museum, as they see words like innovation and technology, and they learn all of the things that have been created, they learn about the history of Black businesses and contribution, they're going to be fired up. They're going to be on mission. And we know they're going to then say, okay, great, where do I go? You know, where are the restaurants? Where are the shops? Where are the stores? Where are the artisans? Don't make me send them to Savannah. And so this is part of the challenge, right? This is part of the challenge. If we are successful really in pushing folks who are very interested in this, we will have money on the table. And so in addition to the programs and the passion from folks like Mayor Tecklenburg and others, I think it's also important that the rest of us are not passive in that, and that we tell folks, I agree with that. Keep it up, keep moving, so that our leaders that really do want to make an impact there know that they have support and they have backup and they can have these stories, because we are going to get those questions and we want to have those answers for folks as they come in. And so you've got the rumor mill and the mouthpiece to also be able to support these businesses, but we need to give them capital investment, time, space, promotion, all of that kind of stuff to be there, so that we're ready to answer those questions.
I have another question. How do you get total community, well, you never get total, but community buy-in and ownership of this museum from recognizing that all aspects of the African American community are not homogeneous, but also recognizing that you've got a greater community that says, well, that's for them. It's not for us. How do you bridge that chasm to get an understanding that this museum is not just for one select part of your population, even though it amplifies that history? See, they're passing around now.
Malik is leading the charge. I will co-sign.
I look there because I think the variety of programming that's going to come out of the museum, the outreach that they've already been doing in the community has been remarkable. It's going to have to continue and reach different aspects of our cultural life, from music to history to business to cuisine, Gullah cuisine, to just a wide variety of impact or connections to various parts of the community to build that.
You know, Mayor, I can see people in your community who say, we got enough tourism right now. We don't need any more folks traipsing up and down these hallowed grounds, okay?
That's right. Well, we believe in quality over quantity. And this is the kind of quality that we seek.
But seriously, yeah.
So, one is, quite frankly, we have to do the work of opening the museum, because the keeping of the promises and animating and operating it. And so we'll just have to prove ourselves up and out and make sure that, and what we have received, which is the greatest confirmation for me, is that when members of the community have had an opportunity to preview the museum, recently we had a community partner with which we've been working for many, many years, Charleston Promise Neighborhoods, and some of the youth from the schools that they labor with, and improving outcomes for these young people in the neck, were able to make their way into the museum. And they were ostensibly refrains that I encountered. One, we didn't have enough time. How much is general admission? Well, what about the kids? Are there annual memberships? It's for all year? What comes with that? Why are those such important messages for me as a museum professional to hear? What it tells me is that the folks, because it's a first voice museum, I want to be very frank, while museums, and if they're not, then my argument would be that they shouldn't be open. Museums are made for everyone. They should be positioned to welcome anyone. For first voice museums that are speaking from the perspective and that are creating a viewpoint through the lens of a specific community. We're the International African American Museum, so we're telling a diasporic story, an international story. But if the Black folks that live around the corner or within walking distance of your institution don't resonate with you when they walk through those doors, you are doing something terribly, terribly wrong. So it is essential that everyone feel welcomed. It is also critical, imperative, that local Black community members resonate with what it is that they're seeing and engaging on the walls of the museum and in the programs that we offer. It doesn't mean there has to be agreement, that there is an understanding that they are being seen. So when I hear that, what that tells me is we're doing our job. When I'm touring one of our donors and they say, this is such incredible and important work, how are you traveling this exhibition? Where are you thinking about taking it next? What that tells me is that we're doing work that's inspiring, that is so, yes, specific in the lens, but so universal in how it can be experienced and understood, that someone that doesn't necessarily personally relate to a single solitary narrative that's being shared in the museum feels compelled in such a way that they want to figure out with you how to expand and deepen the impact and the affect. So those are the ways that we measure, and so much of that is rubber to the road. But so far we're being pretty well affirmed and confirmed, and that's heartening for someone that leads a learning and engagement.
I would say the other part of that for me, and we saw it sort of also in the introductory video, is partly, who do you think works here? And so part of that, when we have sort of Reverend Demet Jenkins, who's generationally here, and now granted, she's a Jenkins, okay, so she got story upon story sort of in the museum in that space. But one of the things that I have been excited about is that as we have started, you know, the bulk of the hiring is folks coming and actually wanting to work at the museum. You asked that question, why do you want to work here? Because I've been waiting for this. And so I think that we also have internal voices that will keep us there and honest. And one of the things that I would say that I have found, you know, as someone who came into the space, I had a different set of ears that always said, well, what was that conversation about? It wasn't so much that folks were concerned, not that the museum wouldn't be for them and tell their story, is that the museum would take their stories away. And so as we have had these previews and folks who have come in and they see folks that they recognize and they know and they see stories that they've heard, they are opening the door a little bit more to that, because I think people were waiting for their worst fears to be achieved kind of in the space. And I think I see that on both sides in terms of, one, that we are not monolithic. And one of the greatest compliments that I heard is that, woof, you feel all the emotions in here. I need to sit down. And that's because we're telling all the different parts of the stories. You know, so we're having those experiences as well. And I think what's about to become very, very important for us is to not sit on this laurel. I think that we're doing a good thing and we're going to launch in a very, very good space. But remember my conversation about community conversation is never one and done. And just because we launch right and just because we have the initial proper collection and hub of stories doesn't mean mission accomplished, go back into office, just keep moving on. That we have to remember what got us here to that space and continue to engage and continue to have conversations and continue to figure out what the next generation of stories inside the museum should be.
You mentioned the actual place. When I worked for Mayor Riley back in the 90s, we planned for the museum to be right across from the South Carolina Aquarium, a piece of property we at the city called Parcel B. And a Dr. McDonald wrote Mayor Riley a letter some 10, 15 years ago raising the awareness of the import of Gadsden's Wharf, and that's when the city shifted gears and bought that property. And like the aquarium, there were citizens that said, why is the city spending all this money to build an aquarium? We've had some naysayers with the International African American Museum along the way. It's about to open. It will be a place of beauty, a place of reflection, a powerful place of spirituality, a place of history, of telling a story that's not been properly told in American history. It will connect with other resources, both cultural and business, in our community. No, we haven't had enough visitors to Charleston yet. I want to see everybody in this room coming down to visit later this year and seeing this remarkable treasure for this state and this nation that we're about to open, and we're all so proud of it. Thank you.
We'll take that invitation. Boy, we've got less than 2 minutes here, so succinctly, I want to address the fact that part of your community engagement and collaboration has to be with existing institutions. We're talking about churches, we're talking about educational institutions. In this day and age, when telling these kinds of stories are so suspect and so threatened within our educational system, how do you jump over that hurdle?
Well, I would say one of the ways that we're seeking to do that actively in the design of our co-curricular activations with schools in particular is centering the personal and then contextualizing it. Really prioritizing the personal human stories of students and then placing that on the timeline. That helps us to make our way around, if you will, some of the conversation. I'll use my library, not my library, my teacher voice.
No, just hold your mic up.
Okay, fair enough. It's incredibly assistive because it's about really centering the student and humanizing the student's experience. And so that's one of the ways that we are working around some of that controversy.
As a takeaway for these in our audience, how do you reimagine and revision the assets of a community?
Boldly. It's boldly, right? Reimagine and re-envision. Think about it. Take it in. Monuments, parks, museums, signs, warehouses, business incubators. Everything is possible and on the table. We built a museum, someone else may do something. I think it is simply answering the call to re-envision and reimagine is 85% of the work. The rest is throwing the party and cutting the ribbon when you get to the end.
And the other counterpart to that, because we talk about storytelling, how do you recognize your story?
With love. I think that love grounds the approach, or that when love grounds the approach, we're much more likely to get to outcomes even beyond what we could have expected when we began the journey.
So you can talk about pain and you can talk about past ills as long as you choose to celebrate the getting over it, or the methods in which you do.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes that is attributed in many places, something to the effect of, love without truth is a lie. Truth without love is an attack. The two of them always have to go together.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be your turn now.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed that. I wish we had more time to continue this line of discussion, but I just wanted to note, what we've heard today, the how And the why and the what of the International African American Museum is relevant to the African American experience in South Carolina and beyond, but again, also to the experiences of so many people across the state. The consideration for the leaders in this room, I think, are several. How do we access the resources and the assets of the International African American Museum for the folks in our own community? Further, how do we leverage the places in our own towns where history happened to tell those stories in our own community? How do we illuminate our community's histories to build understanding, empathy, and respect for each other? How do we advance social justice in doing so? We have time for a few questions from the audience, a little bit of Q&A. And Chairman Johnson, if you'd like to join us on stage. We have so many questions. Let's see what Jill has given me here. Okay, these are good. These are good. That's it. Okay, good. Okay, so let's start with this. I understand that the original inspiration for the museum was Mayor Riley's. What was Mayor Riley's aha moment in 2020? Dr. Matthews.
Sure. Mayor Riley came across a book, Slaves in the Family, by Mr. Ball. And of course, those who had watched Mayor Riley's history know that he has always been about moving things forward, right? Always in that space, the front of those conversations. But the content of that book shocked him. Right? He didn't realize how much hadn't been told and how much hadn't been said and how entwined Charleston's history was with the institution of slavery, from the big picture to personal family stories. And because of that, he decided everybody needed to know. And because it's his way, he decided we're going to build something so that everyone can know. And so that was the impetus and the inspiration. And proper credit to the way he then approached this by, say, bringing in folks like Congressman Clyburn and bringing in those other voices, folks who had known some of that story. And from there, it broadened to being beyond a museum that was just inspired by a single book and a single story to an organization propelled by the entirety of the African American journey.
A related question to that. Early on, or at some point, the decision was made that this would not be a slavery museum. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Black people. It's very interesting because my sister is one of those folks, and she adamantly said, well, what's the museum about? I'm not just going to a museum that's just about slavery. I know that story. I don't necessarily want to be there. But I would also say that Congressman Jim Clyburn, who also had a very business and economic and community development perspective, also had that perspective. Now, he's also a historian, so he wanted the full story, but he also had a keen sense of the spaces that people would go to and would be attracted to. And he was very adamant that you must tell a broader story in order to bring in a wider audience and allow folks to get in where they fit in terms of that. And so there was a lot of balance, because once you do then decide to include the whole story, there's a lot of curation that has to happen because it doesn't all fit. So it was really bringing those different voices to the table and listening and learning and tugging and pulling, a little shouting. I hear some adult beverages were also involved to try to get through all of these conversations. But that is how that came about.
Thank you.
If I may add, the story is told in multiple places as well. And again, the museum can be a springboard for those other places. There is in Charleston on Chalmers Street a small old slave mart museum where that story is told. Let it do its job. The reconstruction effort down in Beaufort, South Carolina, and then adding more to the story. This year, we're breaking ground on a $15 million memorial that will surround Mother Emanuel Church that is going to be inspirational, and also a fountain where 36 bodies were discovered when the Gilliard was rebuilt about 6 or 8 years ago. These few things I just mentioned will all be in walking distance of the museum, and will be an incredible community exploration of this, of many aspects of this story, down to Denmark, VZ, and all the rest. So again, a springboard for telling it's complete and as many of these stories as we possibly can.
Thank you, Mayor. I direct this question toward Malika Pryor Martin. How do you invite people in to this museum who do not feel like it and its stories necessarily connect to them, impact them? How do you sell the importance of this museum to everyone, black and white, and everyone else as well?
So, great question. One of the ways in which I begin a tour, and this is phraseology that I borrowed from Dr. Matthews, but it was particularly pointed and poignant, is that what we endeavor to do from a curatorial perspective, whether it's on the garden level, on the first level, or on the second level when you reach the interior of the museum, is to engage the reality that the African American experience lives at the intersection of great joy and great trauma. Imagine any people throughout the annals of history who have not had, at some point in their story, to live and to operate at that intersection. Imagine our personal lives never having to live at that intersection. There's very little more human, more universal in the human experience than having to traverse both pain and joy. Anybody who's a mother in the audience knows viscerally what I'm referencing. Great pain and great joy. So the story itself, while yes, through an African-American lens, from an African-American perspective, is an American story. It's a Charleston Low Country story. It's a South Carolinian story. It's an international story. And I think one of the opportunities for us to challenge ourselves to do is to accept that a story that's coming from a specific lens is still a part of our collective story. It doesn't sit at the margins. It's intertwined in the fabric of our larger and broader experience. It doesn't live outside in its own context. It exists in context. And this is an opportunity to discover the fabric that we're wrapping ourselves in, all of us, with greater understanding, with greater clarity. And I love the idea of inviting folks, no matter where they're from, to be able to do that and to be in conversation with us while we do that with them.
Thank you for that. Could you, in 2 minutes, talk a little bit about the Center for Family History? Tall order.
So, yes, okay, Jay, so you're also asking a museum professional not to be verbose about something over which they feel incredibly passionate. So, the one thing about the Center for Family History, because it is so popular, is that I have learned an elevator speech for the Center for Family History. And I would say that it also serves as both gallery, but of course a research center, as an opportunity for anyone to begin to engage this story, whether it's the African American story or beginning their own journey of understanding. So the Center for Family History is our genealogy center. We, the IAAM, collect an archive that specifically focuses on African American genealogically relevant and resonant records. However, when you come and you visit as a member of the family, when you come and you join us here at the IAM, part of your general admission experience is of access to the Center for Family History, and part of that is also access to over 400 million records as a result of our partnership with Family Search. And that's a journey that anyone can take via the 4 kiosks that live in the gallery. There's also the opportunity to engage Story Booth, and that's a chance for you, and so think StoryCorps. I imagine we've got some NPR fans in the house, and so you're going to know what I'm referencing. But whether or not that's a grandmother and a granddaughter engaging a conversation, or I just choosing to share a tidbit about my own story and experience, that's a lifelong souvenir that the museum offers to that person. It's linked out to your email. It's something you can have and share with whomever you like. If you choose, you can also allow us to hold on to that as part of our Story Booth archive, because what that offers us the opportunity to do is to begin to build in the aggregate and understanding of some stories, is particularly that are surrounding particular space, place, and time. There are also genealogy one-on-one drop-in courses that will take place twice a day in the center, but then we also have these virtual opportunities, monthly webinars that have actually been taking place. This is a little bit of an answer to Beryl's question earlier. What have we been doing? Well, one of the things that we've been doing for well over 2 years with the Center for Family History is webinars that focus on genealogical history and stories, and so that's something that's offered and available for free every third Saturday by just logging in no matter where you are in the world to be able to engage with those conversations and learn from experts who are doing that work. There's more, but I feel like I'm at 2 minutes.
That was impressive, I think. One more question for you, Malika. In addition to overseeing the work of the Center for Family History, you also oversee the development of the K through 12 assets that the museum will offer. A question here: with educators feeling anxiety about teaching racial history due to confusion about critical race theory and other issues, is there a new or unique role the museum can play to facilitate educating students about America's racial history? And can you also talk a little bit about your hoped for impact on literacy as part of that?
Absolutely. So short answer, yes. So there are 2 ways. One, museums are notoriously, so I'm talking about my sector now, so I'm an inside guy here. We are notoriously lazy when it comes to really impacting upon education. And I was really excited when I came on board at the IAAM and I started saying all sorts of crazy things about what it is that I hope to do, that my president and CEO was like, okay. So there are a couple of things. One, we're starting at the district level with respect to engaging schools, because asking teachers to take on the burden of having to configure and justify and budget and negotiate with both the school and the administrator and their fellow teachers in the classrooms, because Lord knows your class only lasts for 60 minutes, and that if you have district-wide support, it helps to eliminate a lot of that red tape and just the process of being able to get your students to the museum. So that's first and foremost, beginning at the district level. What we are working to do when we talk about those district level partnerships, because we are so fortunate to have the funding, is that every South Carolina student comes and visits the museum for free. And what we have also continued to do is to work towards ensuring particularly, I saw it. Should I finish? Yes. Okay. Making sure that we're also in a position to support wherever needed, or at least where we can and it's needed, transportation, because we know that that's one of the single largest cost factors and therefore barriers. When it comes to K-12 support, so when I say that, I'm talking about co-curricular content that can be shared in the classroom by teachers. One of our challenges that we recognize here in South Carolina, here in Charleston County, where we're located specifically, is this incredible gap. One, no students, irrespective of race, are doing fantastically well when it comes to grade level literacy. When we begin to look at the gap between Black and brown students and their white counterparts, that gap reads abysmally. Well, what does social studies and ELA have in common? A lot of words. A lot of words, a lot of interpretation, a lot of opportunity for critical thinking, a lot of opportunity to engage from an interdisciplinary perspective. Well, what are museums in the business of doing? Interpreting and researching and writing and talking all the time, see? And so being able to hack for and to provide content that's thoroughly researched, that's coming from trusted sources, that teachers know is being offered from a place, again, coming back to that point of credibility and trust, that's coming from a credited, credible, and trusted source that they can literally parachute into their classroom at points that are going to be most relevant to you and be able to utilize in the way that not only helps these young people to be able to bridge that content gap from the perspective of culturally resonant learning, but then also help to bridge that gap when it comes to our students' capacity to be able to engage from a literate perspective.
Thank you. Really something for all of us there, without doubt. I have 2 quick wrap-up questions, one for our chairman and one for our president. Chairman Johnson, understanding that this was a marathon project, has been, will continue to be a marathon project fraught with peaks and valleys, what is a personal, memorable moment or story that inspired you to keep pressing on? And I don't mean the fact that you met your wife in the course of this work, although that's certainly critical.
Yeah. I think if I had to single out a particular instance or a particular story, it would have to be the encounter with African American folks and white folks who said to me over and over and many times and on many occasions, "We're glad you're doing this." I think there is a misperception, perhaps, in some of our communities that slavery or black-white relations, however you want to phrase it, is something that should not be touched, or something that is not or shouldn't be discussed because it dredges up memories, hatred, and that sort of thing. I believe, and I think this museum believes the opposite, that we've got to address these stories, we have to address these issues, and until we do that, and until we do it consistently, and until we do it respectfully, we will never have the progress or achieve the progress that we want to achieve in this country and in this state and in the Charleston community.
Thank you, sir. Yes. And, sir.
Just got to add that that vision that I remember Mayor Riley espousing 25 years ago for this museum to tell an untold story of American history. The sad part is today we see and hear what's going on in school board rooms around the country and in legislatures, a movement of denial of American history, where disparities clearly exist, not just in education, but in health, in income, and in wealth. And it's a sad statement, maybe, but this museum is needed now more than ever at this moment in our history to tell that full story that explains the root of these disparities that exist in our society. And I didn't come here to make a political statement, but I just can't believe the conversations that are going on in school board rooms around the country. It's just, it's despicable. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And our final question going to Dr. Tanya Matthews, President and CEO of this great work. What one takeaway of the many that you could offer would you offer to the leaders in this room as they think about similar work in their communities? Again, maps, markers, memorials, museums, at whatever scale. What one takeaway would you give to the folks in the room today?
I think the takeaway I would give is definitely, I think, one of encouragement, right? We're looking at everything that's happening and that's coming, and we've got all the platitudes to try to encourage us, you know, and to the mayor's point there. One of the things that I would say is that, you know, there are forces and among us, good, bad, doing the best they can, that have been trying to bury these stories, these histories, these truths for centuries. And we have yet to understand that these stories are nothing more than seeds. And that every time we bury them, they grow and they give fruit. And they come up with trees. We are in South Carolina. There is nothing about our history that suggests that we will be building the second largest African American history museum in the country. We are in South Carolina. There is nothing that says that multi-generational families of wealth and worthiness, such as Mayor Joe Riley's family, would be the one to lead the charge. We are South Carolina. Everything that is happening right now is supposed to be impossible, but it has turned out to be inevitable. And this is where we are. And what I would say is that for all of the communities that are embarking on this, no step is too small. No marker is irrelevant. No little plaque should go unseen or be poo-pooed. None of these conversations are going to be one and done or take less than 30 minutes. That's not how that works, ever. So that is one of the things. I would say that those of us who are in this work are relentlessly hopeful. And that is actually a skill set, not just a mindset. And so I would say that it is possible, but it does require also all of the wheels. You've heard about the financial investment from the city, reclaiming property, having leaders, the fundraising, the building, the bringing people from off, and also helping folks to rise up from inside, having to do this. Everyone has to be at the table, not necessarily at the same time, but over the journey of whatever it is that you are doing, and that it is possible. And so I will close with, one of my new favorite encouraging quotes from former Ambassador Andrew Young is, the difficult we do right away. The impossible just takes a little bit longer.
Please help me in thanking our panel.
You're so funny. You work for me.
The moment arrives. So today's discussion tells us to dream big, to remember why we do so, to be a happy warrior, to adapt to cultural and contextual shifts, to include and learn from all voices, to reclaim history, to tell our stories. For their epic and phenomenal and grand scale success in doing so, we are delighted today to honor the International African American Museum. To that end, I invite the Riley Institute's own leader in the fight for equity and justice, former U.S. Secretary of Education and two-term South Carolina Governor Dick Riley, to the stage to present the second annual One South Carolina Partners in Progress Award.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank everybody. Doctor, if you would stand here with me while I make this award. I want to say I'm giving this award on behalf of myself, of course, the Riley Institute, but especially my good friends, former Mayor Joe Riley and Congressman Jim Clyburn, that all of us respect so much, and really all of the people who have contributed to this museum thus far and will contribute in the future, and all those who presented today. Thank you all. That's been a very interesting morning, and I appreciate so much ETV. And public radio woke me up this morning, 6 o'clock. I've gotten over that now, so don't worry about it. But anyhow, we're so proud of the way this presentation is made, and ETV is fully responsible. Now, and that's the truth. It's been made very clear to me today that the International African American Museum is indeed worthy of this award. We're very careful about thinking about that. My friends from Spartanburg were here last year, and Spartanburg Northeast, I guess, is a wonderful, wonderful project, still doing so many good things, and they got the award last year, and of course, this International African American Museum gets it this year. The work of so many people over the past 23 years has brought knowledge, space for reflection, opportunities for social and economic progress, particularly among our Black community. This whole thing is about unification. That's what Spartanburg was about. Really an area that was kind of left out. To unify Spartanburg, making it part of the city. This makes this African American Museum a part of South Carolina. We're unifying things here today. most importantly, is one way for the African American community to reclaim history and for all of us to really come together. One South Carolina. The International African American Museum really provides a wonderful opportunity for us to unify around the common goal of making our nation and our state the best they can be. One nation, one state, all of us together. Unity, that's what we're all about. The then Mayor Joe Riley said at the museum groundbreaking, it's long past time that we tell the true history of our country's history. And when we do, we can begin to heal and move forward together. And that's the hope of this museum, and we have to make that work out. Joe Riley, by the way, is not kin to me. Everybody thinks that we're kin. So I told the people at Spoleto, I was making a speech at Spoleto a number of years ago. Of course, Joe's a lot younger than I am. And I said, everybody's wondering about Riley, and one from the low country, one from the up country. I said, yeah, Joe Riley is my father. That ended all that talk about that. But what a great guy, and of course, the congressman and all of you that have participated, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Matthews, for your leadership. And she made such profound statements. All of these people who participated in the discussions made wonderful, wonderful comments. And I thank them all for that. So it is my great pleasure then to present the Riley Institute 2023 One South Carolina Partners in Progress Award. Remember that word, progress. We're talking about the future, moving forward. And how do you do it? You unify history. And that's what we're about. And that's right exciting when you think about it. So anyhow, let's, where's the award? Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you. Thank you.
And thanks, everybody. We're going to do photos in just a moment, and those will involve Riley staff as well as IAAM staff. So if you guys can kind of come and hover in a moment. Folks, the museum's grand opening is June 27th. We hope you're already making plans for your first visit, but the first couple days are sold out, so you'll have to wait. Thank you so much for being with us today. We are looking forward to seeing you next year at the 3rd annual Building One South Carolina Forum. Please join me in giving one more round of applause to the folks who made this happen. Okay.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. Good luck. Oh, thank you. Touch base with me.
I will.
We'll
do.